Thank y'all very much. It's an honor to be here. I have nice connections to Montgomery. The Colleys are here, and I've got Nakano campers here from my wife, so we're well represented. I'll get right into the story, and I would give this introduction. I found these papers in my sister's basement, and we found 17 boxes of papers, and when I reached under the first box, they were wet. All 17 boxes of papers that were wet. So I would have to peel off a letter, get a hairdryer out, and start drying this letter. And then I made the mistake of reading the letter. And then I was in real trouble because this stack went into the 3 men on the Flying Trapeze, and this stack went into the Chinese Air Force, and this stack went into China National Aviation Corporation, this stack went into Pan American. And his speech cards for him giving speeches, can y'all hear me okay? Okay. Were in a box, and they were on index cards, and they were in no order at all, and none of the speeches were complete. I mean, the index cards were not. So you'd be putting these index, kind of like putting a jigsaw piece together. And when I was in China, there were 2 index cards that are in the book and that I will tell you about. And I had a 3-star general in charge of the People's Liberation Army Museum in Beijing plead with me if he could have those 2 index cards, because they could only put original documents in this museum. And I said yes, and I thought this man was going to fall on the ground. And I sent him these 2 index cards, and he said, these will be on display forever in this museum. So it was really kind of neat that the Chinese thought that much of them. And I was nervous about going to Communist China, but they treated us beautifully. And when you go into a museum and there's a life-size picture of your father on the wall, and it says, these are the along with General Chennault, these are the Americans that came over and saved our bacon against the Japanese, it's hard to dislike those people. So that was how I got introduced to the information. It took 6 years to dry the papers, map him across China, and then pull from the papers the stories, because this box had a little bit of this story in it, and this box had a little bit of this story in it. And then on the cover of the book is Barbara L. Evenson from South Dakota, who came and lived at our home for 1 year, who was the editor, and finally talked her into being co-writer, and she said, well, why do you want my name on the front of the book? And I said, you won't put your name on the front of something that's not excellent. And after 10 months, she turned to me and she said, well, you're right, you know, this is really a good book, and she's now gotten 6 more books, so she made the right decision. So I'll get right into the story. The name of the book is The Shadow Tiger, Billy McDonald, Wingman to Chennault. Mac's next door neighbor was World War I ace Jimmy Meisner. He created a desire to fly in Mac, and he took Mac on his first plane ride at the age of 14, and Mac was hooked. And he would just sit on the end of the bed at his neighbor's house, and his neighbor would tell him about flying in the Lafayette Escadrille in Europe and what combat was like. So he was sort of hooked at an early age. 1930, H.L. Black, junior senator from the state of Alabama, later to be named to the Supreme Court, appointed Mac to flight school at Brooksville in Texas. His last ride in flight school was with check ride was with First Lieutenant Claire Chennault. And Amy, who spoke earlier, you could tell that she has a little bit of Cajun or a little bit of Louisiana pronunciation, because the people in Louisiana call it Chennault instead of Chennault. So I appreciate the pronunciation. And it was the beginning of a friendship that literally lasted a lifetime. From there, he was sent to Selfridge Field in Michigan, where he studied high altitude flying, navigation, and how to fly a tri-motor forward. He's the one on the left who looks like he's extremely cold. He got out in mid-1932 of his 2-year enlistment, spent 4 months looking for a job in the civilian aviation industry, couldn't find one, then went by Maxwell Field in Montgomery. The bottom picture on my right, on your left, is Luke Williamson, and Luke was an old friend from Brooksfield, and he very quickly reintroduced him to now Captain Chennault, who is in the middle, who had just been named the head of the 3 men on the Flying Trapeze, and it was the first Army Air Corps acrobatic team, and it was the predecessor to the Thunderbirds, if you will. And Lieutenant Hansel was leaving the team to go into the bomber wing, and he offered Mac, and I refer to him as Mac in the book, a job as a replacement pilot, which he accepted. He enlisted as a buck private, making $17 a month with a bunk underneath the headquarters building. And it took about 4 months to train him. And over the next 3 years, they performed 50 shows around the United States and were seen by in excess of 1 million people. So they were fairly well-known aviators at the end of that time. Now, this film is, I bought it from Lydia Rossi, who is Dick Rossi, who is a Flying Tiger and also on China National Aviation Corporation, and she is the head of the American Volunteer Group, or the Flying Tigers. So if you want a copy of the entire disc, it's an excellent disc on the entire Flying Tigers, but this gives you an idea of what it looked like.
Chennault was a throwback to the dashing pilots of the First World War. During the 1930s, he had been the leader of a popular flying team in the United States Army Air Corps, who called themselves the 3 Men on the Flying Trapeze. The daredevil stunts of the Flying Trapeze were proof to Chennault that fighter planes could engage in combat in close formation through the most violent of maneuvers. But the high command of the Army Air Corps believed that a new generation of bombers had made fighter planes obsolete, a novelty to amuse the public, but useless in modern warfare. After years of ridicule at the hands of his superiors,
Chennault would continue to fight for his beliefs through 1936. This is a picture of the winners of the 1935 Miami air races. On the left is McDonald, in the middle is Chennault, and on the right is Williamson. They were seen by a Chinese delegation of officers who were recruiting trainers for the Chinese Air Force, and they offered all of them lucrative contracts to go to China to train Chinese fighter pilots. Chennault declined on behalf of all 3 pilots, but asked the Chinese to keep the offer open until he got the results back from the second lieutenant's exam. And there were 80 sergeants, and it was including Sergeant McDonald and Sergeant Williamson in the military who'd taken this test for second lieutenant, and you guess it, there were only 2 people that failed, and it was McDonald and Williamson. And Chennault took this as a personal insult from the high command and wrote a scathing op-ed in the Montgomery Advertiser, and came back and told McDonald and Williamson that they should accept the Chinese offer, and they bought out their enlistments for $89.60 apiece, went to the Chinese embassy in Washington and picked up $500 in cash, made their way across country to Vancouver. And it was very important that they got on a Canadian ship, the Empress of Russia, not a U.S. ship due to the Neutrality Act. And also getting on that ship with the other personnel that Chennault was sending to China. And Montgomery's own C.B. Smith, who was his mechanical genius, got on that boat, as did Ralph Watson, who was his armament specialist, and off they went to China. When they got to China, they went to Hangzhou and went to the Central Aviation School. They were greeted by Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of the Aeronautical Commission, and she informed them that you have 1 year to work with these men, and a great deal is expected of your work. And as far as we can tell, Daddy took this picture. And this is the 1936 hand cow advanced training class, and most of these pilots would die within 1 year of the start of the war. And the reason was there were 91 combat-ready Chinese planes, and there were 500 to 700 combat-ready Japanese planes. So this was a mismatch from the word go. This is the CIA report released in 2010, and it chronicles Madame Chiang Kai-shek sending McDonald into China on a spy mission to pick up Chennault. He was given a new name, a new passport, and a new cover story that he was the manager of an entertainment group of 42 entertainers. When he got past immigration officials, he jumped a train and went to Yokohama. He got on board the USS Garfield, found Chennault. They slipped off the boat. They rented an open car or convertible. McDonald took pictures, Chennault took notes, and the article goes on to say that, like two young operatives, they had an unhealthy appetite for getting too close to airfields and harbor installations. And it took them 3 days to drive back to Kobe, Japan, where McDonald had entered the country and where the Garfield had moved, because you kind of went up these ports when you were going up the coast of Japan. And they got back on the Garfield and they made their way back to Japan. Now, this is a picture of the Izumo. It is a light Japanese cruiser. It is the headquarters for the Japanese Imperial Forces in China in 1937. In the background is a really rather pretty picture of Shanghai Harbor. On July 7th, 1937, the Japanese attacked the Chinese at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, and many consider it was definitely the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and many consider it to be the start of World War II. On August the 13th, this ship began shelling the Shanghai Civic Center, and Chuck Sharp, chief pilot and captain of China National Aviation Corporation, climbed up on top of the bank building in Shanghai Harbor to where the RAF Flying Club was located to observe the action. And when he looked down the Yangtze River, there were 3 Chinese fighter planes coming down the Yangtze River headed straight for the Izumo. And they were in suspiciously close formation. And it dawned on him that those are probably not Chinese pilots. And all 3 planes came in and made dive bombing attacks on the Izumo, and to Sharp's amazement, and I found the original document in a box marked Chennault's private papers that Daddy had, and there was only one paper from somebody else in there. It was from Captain Sharp. And all 3 pilots missed by inches the plane, the boat, and then they came back and strafed the Izumo several times each and then flew off. Captain Sharp got down from the bank building and later confronted Chennault, McDonald, and Williamson and asked them, was it true that you were paid $1,000 apiece to attack the Izumo? They would neither deny or confirm the rumor. When I was in China in 2016, I spoke to the Kunming Aviation Association and had a 2-star general retired come up and tell me that the story was absolutely accurate and very well known in China. This is a P36 prototype, and under Chennault's contract, the Chinese were obligated to supply him with the plane of his choice. It had no military markings, it had no weapons, it was an observation plane, but it was the plane that Chennault wanted. And they delivered it to him in Nanking, the capital of China, at the aerodrome at the base of Purple Mountain. One of the first things Chennault did is he had the radio stripped out of the plane. He didn't need a radio because he couldn't hear. He was almost completely deaf at this point. The plane was the fastest plane in China and the highest flying plane in China. And Chennault would use it and would fly up and circle around McDonald's squadron, because if you were a single American advisor, you were given the option of becoming a squadron commander, which he accepted. And he would make notes on the strengths and weaknesses of the Japanese planes, how the Japanese pilots were trained, what maneuvers they liked and what maneuvers they didn't like. And on one of those missions, he was fired on by a Japanese plane. And he took great exception to that event. And when he landed the plane, he told the ground crews, he said, I want you to put guns on this plane, and I want you to put them on there as fast as you can get them on there. And the next SOB that shoots at me, I'm going to shoot back. And it took him about 4 days to get guns on the plane. And the first person to take the plane up to test it was McDonald. And he landed a short time later with bullet holes in the tail of the plane and reported that 3 guns had not fired and 1 gun had only fired half a load. And he said, I think it would be a really terrific idea if you guys got these other guns working before you sent the colonel up in this plane. And this is a picture of General Chennault giving McDonald instructions before a mission. The Hawk 75 is in the background being rearmed and refueled. And this is at the same air base in Nanking at the base of Purple Mountain. And occasionally after they would get their squadrons off to attack the Japanese, they would walk across from the aerodrome to the Nanking Country Club, and they would play golf until their squadron came back. And when their squadrons came back, they would go back and get the report. And then they would walk up the hill of Purple Mountain to Nanking Clubhouse, where they were roommates. And at night, they would play ping pong, team ping pong, and they would always play C.B. Smith and Harry Sutter. Harry Sutter was a Swiss radio specialist who was tried for espionage at the end of the war and found not guilty. And McDonald had other duties at this aerodrome, and one of the duties was every time there was an air raid, and there were air raids 66 days in a row at this aerodrome, and on some days there were more than one attack in a day from the Japanese. His job was to fly the Hawk 75 out of danger to keep it safe. And he seemed to come back with bullet holes and empty guns on most of those occasions. And it is a calculation, it is not an exact number, but we calculate that he had 124 encounters with armed Japanese planes over Nanking. He found the carrier Rougeau and sent his squadron to attack it. He found the carrier Kaga, which was sunk at Midway. They were informed by Ambassador Johnson that they both had bounties on their heads from the Japanese, and that 2 squadrons of Japanese planes in Shanghai had been assigned to specifically shoot down this one airplane. So they must have been doing some sort of damage. And I'm going to read this because there's really no other way to get the flavor of it, but this is from the British Archives. British Naval Attaché Robert S. Aiken's intelligence report on May 7th, 1939. That night I had dinner with Colonel Chennault and an American instructor named McDonald. The latter is credited with having brought down a large number of Japanese, but he was reluctant to talk about his combat activities. The story, for what it's worth, is that he was paid so much per hostile aircraft crashed. He was making so much that the Chinese reduced the payment to $1,000 in gold per plane when McDonald said that on those terms they could go and shoot the blankety things down themselves. And it does make you wonder, if they cut him to $1,000, how much were they paying him before? Now, they were chased out of Nanking. When Nanking fell, they went to Hankow, about 150 to 200 miles to the west, to regroup. The government also went to Hankow to regroup. And from there, they went, the school went to Kunming, which was as far west as you could go in China, and the government went to Chungqing, which is also as far west as you could go in China. And McDonald estimated that it would take 2 years to train a Chinese fighter pilot from scratch. So in 1940, in their new Hawk 75 version M's, they were holding their own against the Japanese, defending Chungqing, when all of a sudden the Japanese introduced the Zeros. And the Zeros shot down the entire Chinese Air Force. All 27 planes were shot down in one battle. And the Chinese Air Force was effectively done at that point. They had a few planes left, but not many. And McDonald was technically out of a job, and so was Chennault. Chennault made plans to go back to the United States to see if he could get the American Volunteer Group or the Flying Tigers up and running as fast as he could, and to get pilots and planes headed toward China as quickly as he could. And he realized that if he came back with 100 pilots and 100 planes, that he would need ground transportation to move the ground crews from one air base to another air base, because if they were just at one air base, the Japanese would overwhelm them with bombers and planes, and they would just be done. So for that purpose, he picked China National Aviation Corporation, which was 55% owned by the Chinese and 45% owned by Pan American. They had 9 airplanes. They were based in Hong Kong, which was surrounded by the Japanese. They were a unique airline in that they only took off at night because the Japanese didn't fly at night. They are the only airline in the history of warfare to ever have a published schedule in a war zone. They are the only airline in history to ever cancel a flight at night due to excessive moonlight. In McDonald's first flight, he got to negotiate, as did Captain Engel and Captain Higgs, who were 3 pilots who were also sent by Chennault into CNAC, and they were put there for a reason. Chennault realized that the time was probably going to come, if he got the Flying Tigers to China, that he was going to need some allies in CNAC to help move the ground crews around, so that's why they were put there. And McDonald got to negotiate his own contract, which called for a tripling of pay in 3 years and an option to go with Pan American as a captain at the time of his choosing. He could go back to the United States at any time he wanted to go, and he would be made a captain, and he could forego the 5 years of seniority that was normally required. This is a picture of his first flight into Chungqing. And you'll notice that in Chungqing was a very difficult place to land, in that the airstrip is in the middle, it's on a sandbar in the middle of the Yangtze River, and you had to fly over wires at 3,000 feet that came across the mountains. And when you got over the wires, you had to make a dive for the runway, so it was not a very pleasant landing. So they are trying to get his rear wheel out of the mud so they can get him back on the runway so he can avoid the firebombing from the Japanese that day. This is a picture of the runway on the sandbar in the middle of the Yangtze River, and you can see the wires. I think you can see the wires in the background. Yep. And the guy in the picture is Ned Jones from Birmingham, who was nice enough to introduce Billy McDonald to his girlfriend in Shanghai, also from Birmingham, Peggy Spain. When Chennault got the pilots and the planes for the Flying Tigers headed toward China, the first person he came to see when he came back to China was McDonald, and he named him the Chief of Staff of the AVG. And McDonald said, okay, I'll take the job, but I got to get a leave of absence from CNAC, and I've got to get a leave of absence from Pan American, because I'm not giving up my option to go back to the United States to be a captain with Pan American. And neither airline would give him a leave of absence, so Chennault said, that's fine, you've got to find a replacement. And he did. He found Harvey Greenlaw, who was a friend of his, who sold planes to the Chinese. And that story is told in the book, Lady and the Tiger, and not the second book written by Dan Ford, but the first book. And it's a really fun book to read. He also made it into the comic strips. His roommate was Frank Higgs, who was a drinking buddy of Milton Caniff, who wrote the comic strip Terry and the Pirates. And he played the character Dude Hennig in the comic strip, and he talked Caniff into putting McDonald in the comic strip, and he is the only person who was in the comic strip who played himself. He just put a K at the end of Mac, so it became M-A-C-K. Caniff was working on his comic strip one day. They were seen by 31 million people during the war years. And all of a sudden, all these cars pull up, and it's the FBI. And they've got machine guns and pistols, and they come charging in his office, and they wanted to arrest him for espionage, for putting classified information in the comic strips. And he had a very difficult time convincing the FBI that he was not a spy, that he'd gotten him from his drinking buddy from Ohio State, Frank Higgs. But you can still buy these comic strips in coffee table book form. There's 7 volumes of them, and you can get them from Amazon, and I've gotten them, and they're really quite entertaining still today. This was a flight that he flew from Hong Kong to Kunming with $10 million of gold bearer bonds. And he was trying to avoid some Japanese fighter planes and intentionally flew into a thunderstorm. And the radio operator was a little bit slow rolling in the antenna, so they were struck 3 times by lightning. And the plane had all electronics were burned up, and the plane was definitely going down. And the co-pilot panicked, and the radio operator had to pull him out of his seat and had to get in his seat to help McDonald try and land the plane. And when they busted through the clouds at the bottom of the storm, lo and behold, there was a road being built by 1,000 Chinese coolies. And when he finished the rollout, there were 2 feet to spare on each side of the wheels. So it was a pretty good drop off when you look up by the plane. And it was a mud road. It hadn't been surfaced yet, so the wheels picked up a lot of mud, and the weight of the mud in the engines caused the plane to go nose down when it rolled out. And the co-pilot got out of the plane and just started running. And it's, where are you going? And he never responded. So over the next 12 days, the coolies built him a runway. He got people to come in and repair the plane. He landed the plane in Kunming and reported that the gold is here, the plane is here, the crew is here, except we're short 1 co-pilot who was last seen running northeast in Sichuan province, China. Made it into the Los Angeles Examiner and Collier's magazine. He wrote a letter home to his parents, which was sort of the basis of the book, where he tried to write a letter home every 2 weeks. This one was dated December the 6th, 1937. He said the Japanese will attack the Hawaiian Islands. He and 5.5 million Chinese knew that the Japanese would attack the Hawaiian Islands. It was just a matter of when. The only people who didn't know the Japanese were going to attack the Hawaiian Islands were the Americans in the Hawaiian Islands. On December 7th and 8th, 1941, and this gets into the really important part of the book, it was the same day due to the international dateline. Pearl Harbor was attacked on the 7th. Hong Kong was attacked on the 8th of 1941. And they blew up the Pan American Clipper that was moored alongside the runway, and they blew up all of the CNAC planes on the runway. And McDonald had the only CNAC plane that was not in Hong Kong. He was in Rangoon, Burma, with a plane load of passengers. And he had a decision to make. Did he go to Chungqing, or did he divert to Taungoo, Burma, which was a British base where Colonel Chennault was training the Flying Tigers? And he wanted to know what the colonel knew. He wanted to make sure the colonel was okay, and he wanted to see if the colonel had any orders. So he landed in Taungoo in between 66 P-40s with their engines running, with 66 angry Americans sitting in the seats ready to repel an attack from the Japanese. He pulled his plane over, did not stop the engine, dropped the door open, jumped out of the bottom of the plane, ran across the field. Chennault's running the other way. They had about a 5-minute meeting in the middle of the field, and I could find no record of what they talked about during that 5-minute meetings, but when you look at the actions of the 2 men over the next 30 days, you can pretty well figure what they talked about. He got back on his plane, flew to Chungqing, was told by the station manager in Chungqing that we cannot get Hong Kong on the radio at all. Hong Kong has been overrun, and you probably have the last CNAC plane left in existence, and under no circumstances are you to go to Hong Kong. He thanked him for his advice. He slammed the door and took off for Hong Kong and landed at 1 o'clock in a blacked out city, and was delighted to find that all of the CNAC personnel were fine, and that they were servicing the 5 airplanes that the Japanese had missed when they didn't bomb the hangars in Hong Kong. They serviced his airplane and loaded it with the Chinese Currency Board and other Chinese officials for him to fly back to Chungqing at 2 o'clock in the morning. He had arrived at 1 o'clock in the morning, and at 1:30, a warning came in from the Japanese that said any pilot who takes off from this airbase will be subject to having his head cut off if he is captured. So at 2 o'clock, he flew to Chungqing. He dropped off the Currency Board, and they got about 3 hours sleep. they flew back to Hong Kong and participated in a 4-day evacuation of 275 people from Hong Kong. Now, Captain Chuck Sharp, who I had mentioned earlier, was the chief pilot, and McDonald was the co-pilot, and he was the chief pilot of the last flight out of Hong Kong. It was a DC-2 that was rated to carry 22 passengers. They had 74 passengers on board. When they went down the runway, they could hear the Japanese gunfire in the background. And when the plane went off the end of the runway, it didn't go up, it went down. And right before it was going to hit the water, the ground effect kicked into play and the plane began to fly. And it clawed its way back up into the air, and they made their way back to Chungqing. They dropped off their passengers and picked up all of the CNHD personnel along with Mr. Bill Bond, who was the vice president for Pan American, and they headed for Calcutta, which was going to be their new base of operations. Bond had already been in touch with the British and told them that they were coming. When they landed, they told the British what their plans were. They were going to fly, they were going to load the planes with gasoline and gunpowder and fly over the Himalayan mountains on the northern route from Calcutta and the southern route from Denjon. And when they got to from Calcutta to Kunming, in Kunming, they would load the planes with tungsten from the local mines. And when they flew back over the hump the other way with the tungsten, which is really quite heavy material, they would swap it for more gunpowder and gasoline and do it again. So after 2 days in Calcutta, they came to McDonald with 2 pilots, Captain Higgs and Captain Engel, and 3 planes, and said, you are to go on a rescue mission to Toungoo. The Japanese are trying to overrun Burma, and you are to rescue General Chennault, or Colonel Chennault at that time, and the first 2 squadrons of the maintenance crews for the Flying Tigers, and get all of their crew equipment and put it on these planes. So it's kind of obvious that what was said in that conversation on the tarmac between McDonald and Chennault was, one plane's not going to cut it. You got to go to Hong Kong and you got to come back with 3 planes, or we're dead men. If we don't get out of here in the next 30 days, we're going to die. And had they stayed there 30 days, they would have died because the Japanese overran it in that period of time. So they arrived at midnight. They loaded up all the equipment. They flew to Kunming. The P-40s flew in midday on the 19th. On the 20th of December, the Japanese flew 11 bombers over Kunming, not knowing that the Flying Tigers were there. So the Flying Tigers came out of the sun. They shot down 4 of the 11 bombers in the first pass. They chased the other 7 bombers off, and only 1 of those bombers ever made it back to base, and Kunming was never bombed again for the entire war. What's important about that moment in history, and think about it, the war is not 30 days old at this point, is the Flying Tigers had an offensive base of operations in China against the Japanese, which would come in very handy on the next slide. This is a picture of me with the very cute translator in the Kunming Museum, and just over my head you can see on top of the mountain the Japanese High Command, and the Japanese High Command is looking down on the picture in the middle, and the picture in the middle is of the Salween River Bridge, and the bridge is filled with Japanese special forces. And the Japanese were trying to sneak from Burma across the Salween River Bridge into China. And Tex Hill and the Flying Tigers, Tex Hill was from San Antonio and one of the pilots, he and his squadron flew through and blew up the bridge. And the next day when he came back, there was another bridge, and it was filled with Japanese special forces. It was a pontoon bridge, and they blew that bridge up. And when they came back to the third day, the Japanese were gone. Now, what's important about this moment in history is, had they crossed that bridge, the Chiang Kai-shek knew it, and the Chinese knew it, they would have taken Chungqing, they would have taken Kunming, Chinese would have fallen to the Japanese, and the written plan that was found that the Japanese had was to conscript between 2 and 5 million Chinese troops to fight alongside the Japanese against the Allies in the Pacific. Now think about it. The early stages of World War II, how thinly stretched were the Allies in the Pacific? Very thinly stretched. There were 1 million Japanese troops that were being held down by the Chinese while they were in the war. Had there been 6 million troops, additional 6 million troops to confront the Allies in the Pacific, the outcome in the Pacific probably would have been much different than the way it turned out. So the flights that were made into Kunming turned out to be really quite important. McDonald then went back to his day job, which was flying gasoline and gunpowder over the hump. And this is a quote from Albert C. Wiedemeyer, commander of U.S. forces in China, said, "Flying the hump was the foremost and by far the most dangerous, difficult, and historic achievement of the entire war. It was only 500 miles, but the weather on both sides of the hump was never predictable, and it was an extraordinarily dangerous flight. CNAC lost 88 planes in 4 years, and the Army Transport Command lost 500 planes. It was referred to as the aluminum trail because when you look down, you could just see all these planes littered on the ground in 3 years in the war, but they did manage to keep China in the war." McDonald's most memorable flight was Chiang Kai-shek was asked by Churchill to fly to India to meet with Nehru and Gandhi. And the goal was to talk the Congress Party, and they were the head of the Congress Party, into not opposing the British in World War II, which is a really, really big deal. So when they landed in New Delhi, McDonald was horrified when there was the press taking all these pictures of Chiang Kai-shek, and when he opened the paper the next day, here's Chiang Kai-shek on the front page of all the Indian papers, and he realized that the Japanese spies knew where Chiang Kai-shek was at that particular moment in time. So he talked Chiang Kai-shek into leaving at midnight, and he talked the British into giving him a Spitfire escort to the Indian border. So they left at midnight, they flew to the border without incident, and he managed to make it back to Chungqing and turn over Madame Chiang Kai-shek and Generalissimo and their staff to Chennault and say, "Here's your cargo, and please take good care of these people. I'm very glad to be rid of them." This is a picture of McDonald and his girlfriend Peggy Spain shortly after they had gotten married in Calcutta on August the 1st, 1944. They went on their honeymoon in Kashmir. They also went on a tiger hunt on the back of elephants with the Maharaja of Cooch Behar, who was a very close friend of CNAC. My father is smiling in that picture because he's just shot his first tiger, which you get to see in this picture. And my mother is in a really serious need of a drink. My sister Cameron was born in Shanghai on January the 8th, 1947. Her godmother was Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and her godfather was General Chennault. And people say, "Well, Billy, that's very interesting. Who were your godparents?" I said, "I have absolutely no idea." And on August the 1st, 1947, Mac reluctantly left China in that Mao Zedong was right around the corner, and it didn't seem like a great place to raise a brand new baby girl. In 1958, he got a call from Chennault and asked him to come to Waterproof, Louisiana, asked both mother and daddy to go and help him plan his funeral at Arlington Cemetery. And this is a picture of the funeral in Arlington Cemetery. He personally told me that his job was, he was given a legal pad by the general, and he said, "I want you to write these names down." He said, "These are the admirals and generals that I want you to specifically call and tell them that they're not invited to my funeral." So that was his duty. In 1977, and I forget the exact month and day, he started on his book, and he actually was writing it out by hand, believe it or not. He did write out an outline for me, which I was very grateful. And within that month, he had a stroke and lost the ability to speak, and his right arm was paralyzed, and it looked like his book wouldn't get written until I found the papers in 2010. He died in 1985, and as a tribute to the last of the 3 men on the Flying Trapeze, the 106 Observation Squadron in Birmingham flew the missing man formation in Phantom F-4s over the gravesite. And I did fine until all the old pilots started just weeping at the funeral when these planes went over. So I was great up to that point. And for 4 years, I worked on getting him his Distinguished Flying Cross and his Air Medal, and that's Colonel Newton, who will be awarded on December 1st here at the Capitol, his star as a general. Jeff Sessions, Champ Lyons from Mobile, and Colonel Newton helped get him his Distinguished Flying Cross and his Air Medal, and it was awarded on August 24th at Maxwell Field. They did a very nice military ceremony, and it was a kind of the icing on the cake. So that's how the book ends. So I hope you enjoyed that story. If anybody has a question, I'd be more than happy to answer it. And if not, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. McDonald. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and either myself or Mary Beth will pass you the microphone. We're recording today's session. She's got it. She's faster.
Thank you for taking my question. We've got an old John Wayne movie. And some of the stuff that you had talked about in this, it looked like they had taken excerpts from actual events and put it in this John Wayne movie. He was a commander of the Flying Tigers.
Right. I had the same movie, and they did exactly that. It was based on Chennault's life. Okay. And it's not all accurate. Right. But it was a fun movie to watch. I certainly enjoyed it. There's
a scene where one of the guys flies in a passenger plane and lands in the mud in a storm, can't see anything, and he leaves Pan Am, I think, at that point. And I just wondered if it had, been kind of...
It very well could have been Daddy. Chennault and Daddy were very good friends, and I will tell you one story that's not in the book, because my editor refused to allow me to put anything in the book that I didn't have a document to back it up.
Right.
And Daddy told me the story several times, but I could find no document to back the story up. But he and the general liked to hunt, and so when his gun came over from Louisiana, he called up Daddy on the other side of China and said, "You got to get me some 12-gauge shells, because if we're going to go hunting, I got to have some shells." So he went to a British base and traded some whiskey with some shells, and they were going sand crane shooting. And there was one night, in the middle of the night, there's a knock on the door, and it's the general, and he says, "Come on, Mac, we got to go rescue Joe. Joe is in such and such a city, and the Japanese lines have moved forward and they've overrun the city." So they loaded up a bunch of pilots with shotguns and machine guns and hand grenades, and they landed on a strip from the moon, from the glow of the city and the moonlight. And they snuck their way into the city, but they had to shoot their way out, and they got Joe out. And I thought, well, gee, and it really never showed up, because Daddy certainly didn't want to tell anybody that he'd used one of the CNAC planes for that. And the general at that point was a 2-star general who had no business flying out on a mission like that. And I said, well, who in the world was Joe? And he said, well, that was his dachshund. And there's some very interesting pictures of Joe, and Daddy had given him that dog when he first got to China. And I think there were several versions of Joe in the history over there. But CNAC will have its reunion next year in Dallas. The ABG will have their reunion in Dallas next year, and they have invited CNAC to join them. And the first CNAC reunion was to join an ABG reunion in New York. But they were very close. And Eddie also, when the Flying Tigers was disbanded, General Bissell, being the very tactful general that he was, came in and informed the Flying Tigers that he said, "You will all re-enlist tomorrow morning, and there will be no exceptions. It's your prior rank, and anybody who refuses to re-enlist, we will not lift one finger to get you back to the United States." And when he walked in the next morning, one of the gentlemen stood up. Remember, they were civilians. They were not in the United States military. Stood up and saluted General Bissell and said, "General Bissell, blank you." And they all walked out. And I'm convinced that Daddy was there with a kind of a sign, like a lemonade stand, and he signed 17 of the pilots up to fly for CNAC, and they became very good friends. But he and Chennault were considered to be best friends, and I think that was borne out with the way they lived their lives.
Are any of those men alive today?
There's one, I can't pronounce it, it's kind of like a Russian name. There's one AVG mechanic who's still alive. There are 2 CNAC pilots that are 104. And last year at 103, we had to wait because he was coming back from a fishing trip up the river in Miramar. And there's another pilot in New York, Pete Goodyear, who is 102. But there are not many left, but very historic characters. Well, thank y'all all for coming very much. Yes, sir.
What did your father do after he came back to the States?
Well, he came back to the States and immediately became a Pan American pilot. They went to Miami. They had me on July 19th, 1947. He flew the South American routes, and he was given a choice of going to New York or to Rio in Brazil. And being a good Southerner, the idea of going to New York was utterly horrifying. So they went to Rio, which was a beautiful city back then, not like it is today, and he flew to Argentina. And at the end of 3 years, my mother got polio. My sister and I both got polio, but it manifested itself sort of like a cold. Mother's was a good bit more severe, and the doctors called him and said, "We think it's time that you retire." So he retired in 1952. His compatriot, Captain Sharp, continued to fly for Pan American until 67. But when he retired, he had just short of 25,000 hours as a pilot. That's a lot of hours in the air. Well, thank y'all. Oh, we got one more? Okay.
Thanks for the talk. What an amazing, adventurous life your dad lived. Pardon this question, but I was a little confused by a slide that you showed, and maybe I just didn't understand, but it was, I guess, a quote from your dad who said, "The Japanese will attack the Hawaiian Islands." And so
Right.
December 6th, 1937.
That's correct. And it's in the book, and it was in a letter that he wrote home to his parents. He also wrote them home during the Battle of the Bulge. And it was 7 days into the Battle of the Bulge, and he said, "If the Russians lose, Birmingham, Alabama may not be a safe place to live." So he and Chennault they had a radio, and they could listen to Berlin, and they could listen to London, and they could listen to all the different places around the world that had English broadcasts. So they knew what was going on in the war. And the Chinese were deathly afraid of the Japanese, and the Chinese are still deathly afraid of the Japanese. He knew that they were going to attack the Hawaiian Islands. There's a book called Preemptive Strike by a man named Alan Armstrong in Atlanta. And his premise in the book is that Roosevelt was trying to engineer an attack by American paid pilots, the Flying Tigers being the genesis of it, against Japan. And the bombers were sitting on a field in California waiting to be delivered to the Flying Tigers. And I forget the pilot's name who was going to be the lead pilot for the pilots. But his argument was that the Japanese just got to us before we got to them. But there was going to be a war between those two countries. It was just a matter of when, if that sounds sort of vaguely familiar with today's setting. He just.
What struck me is it said December 6th, the day almost exactly 4 years.
Well, it struck me the same way. But his belief was, it wasn't that he was prescient. All of the Chinese believed that the Japanese would attack the Americans. It was just a matter of when. But I thought it was an interesting quote to put in the book, as did my editor. So, anybody else? Well, thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate it. And if you just feel compelled to buy a book, my wife will be out front with the books. So.